Margaret Hayes spent years trapped by 7 prescription bottles that drained her bank account while her health only declined. The pharmaceutical system had convinced her that expensive medications were her only option, dismissing simple natural remedies as worthless folklore. But when her neighbors shared one ancient secret 2 raw garlic cloves before bed, everything changed in ways her doctors never predicted. Just wait until you hear how this 73-year-old nurse proved the medical establishment wrong and reclaimed her life with something that costs less than $1. Margaret Hayes sat in her kitchen at 2 in the morning, the house silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator her husband had bought 20 years ago. The prescription bottles were lined up on her counter like tiny soldiers preparing for battle, a battle she was losing. 7 different medications, 7 copays that ate into her Social Security check every month, forcing her to choose between her health and other necessities. Her hands trembled as she reached for the blood pressure medication, the arthritis in her fingers making every movement painful. The childproof cap mocked her efforts. She had to use a dish towel for grip, twisting until her wrists ached. The irony cut deep. Childproof caps when she had no children to protect, no grandchildren who visited often enough to worry about. Just her and these bottles locked in their nightly struggle. At 73, Margaret had accepted that this was her life now. The acceptance had come gradually, like winter settling over a landscape. First the cane, then the weekly pill organizer, then the slow surrender of activities she once loved. Doctor appointments every other week filled her calendar where lunch dates and volunteer shifts used to be. Pills with breakfast, the pink one, the white oval, the small yellow tablet. Pills with dinner 2 capsules and another tablet. Pills before bed, the routine that brought her to this counter at 2 in the morning when sleep refused to come. Her daughter Jennifer called it managing her health, using that bright, encouraging voice that made Margaret feel like a child again. But Margaret knew what it really was. She called it by its true name in the quiet hours when no one could hear, slowly dying while the pharmaceutical companies got rich. Each medication treated a symptom but caused another. The blood pressure pill made her dizzy. The cholesterol medication gave her muscle pain. The pill for acid reflux caused headaches, and on, an endless cycle of treatment and side effects. She had been a nurse for 40 years before retiring. 40 years of 12-hour shifts, of holding hands and saving lives, of knowing exactly which medication to give and when. She had seen everything in those years, miracle recoveries and tragic losses, families brought together and torn apart. She had helped everyone who came through those hospital doors, never thinking that one day she would be the patient, the one struggling to maintain dignity while her body betrayed her. Now she sat alone in a house too big for one person. The living room where she and Robert had danced on their anniversary. The bedroom where they had whispered plans for retirement that death had stolen from them. He had been gone 5 years, but some mornings she still reached for him in bed, forgetting for just a moment that she would spend the rest of her life alone. Her body was falling apart piece by piece, like an old house succumbing to time. First her knees, then her back, then her heart, then her blood, then her bones. Each doctor's visit revealed another system in decline, another organ that needed monitoring, another reason to add one more bottle to her counter. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent her entire career helping people heal, and now she couldn't heal herself. All that knowledge, all that experience, and she was powerless against the simple fact of aging. Modern medicine could extend her life, but couldn't give her back the quality of living. Margaret twisted the cap again and finally heard the satisfying pop. She shook out one pill, swallowed it with lukewarm water from the tap, and returned the bottle to its place in the formation. Her neighbor Dorothy had stopped by earlier that day, and Margaret had almost not answered the door. She had been having a bad morning, her joints stiff and uncooperative, her mood matching the gray sky outside. But Dorothy's cheerful knock was persistent, so Margaret had shuffled to the door, prepared to make polite excuses about why she couldn't chat long. But when she opened the door, she had stopped mid-excuse. Dorothy stood on her porch practically glowing. At 76, 3 years older than Margaret, Dorothy looked better than Margaret had seen her in years, maybe better than she'd looked in a decade. Her skin had a healthy flush, not the pale gray that Margaret saw in her own mirror each morning. Dorothy's eyes were bright and alert, not clouded with pain or dulled by medication. She moved with an ease that Margaret envied, stepping into the house without the usual complaints about her knees or her back, without the careful movements of someone afraid their body might give out at any moment. "Margaret, I brought you some of that tea you liked," Dorothy had said, setting a small bag on the kitchen table. "And I wanted to see how you were doing. You didn't come to book club last week." Margaret had made excuses, the usual ones about not feeling well, about the weather affecting her joints. But she couldn't stop staring at Dorothy, trying to figure out what had changed. They had been partners in misery for years, sharing complaints about doctors and medications, commiserating over the indignities of aging. But now Dorothy looked like she had stepped back in time. "What's your secret?" Margaret had finally asked, half joking, trying to keep the envy out of her voice. "Did you find the fountain of youth in your backyard?" Dorothy had laughed, and that was when Margaret really knew something had changed. It was that genuine laugh Margaret remembered from years ago, before arthritis had twisted Dorothy's hands and diabetes had stolen her energy, before aging had stolen Dorothy's joy along with her health. "Better than that," Dorothy had said, her eyes twinkling with a secret she was dying to share. "I'll tell you, but you'll think I'm crazy," Margaret had insisted, curiosity overcoming her bad mood. She had gestured for Dorothy to sit at the kitchen table, the same table where they had shared countless cups of coffee and complaints over the years. Dorothy had leaned in conspiratorially, lowering her voice even though they were alone in the house. "2 cloves, raw garlic cloves, every night before bed for the past 3 months." Margaret had stared at her, waiting for the punchline. When none came, she had repeated the word slowly, making sure she had heard correctly. "Garlic?" "I know how it sounds," Dorothy had said quickly, her words tumbling out in excitement. "I know exactly how it sounds. My grandson Tommy showed me some article online about natural remedies. You know how he is, always reading about health and wellness. He said garlic was one of the most powerful natural remedies, that people have been using it for thousands of years. I figured, what did I have to lose? The worst that could happen was I'd smell like an Italian restaurant." Dorothy had paused, making sure Margaret was listening, and then delivered the line that would change everything. "Margaret, I stopped taking my cholesterol medication 2 weeks ago. My doctor ran tests. My levels are better than they've been in a decade. Not just stable, better." She couldn't believe it. Couldn't. Margaret had felt a flash of something, hope, maybe, or disbelief, or that particular kind of skepticism that comes from years of medical training. She had smiled politely and changed the subject, steering the conversation to safer topics like the weather and the new family moving in down the street. Dorothy had sensed her doubt and hadn't pushed, leaving an hour later with a hug and a knowing smile. But now at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep because her acid reflux was acting up again despite the medication, Margaret found herself thinking about it. She stood and walked to her medicine cabinet, opening it to survey the rows of bottles. This wasn't a cabinet anymore. It was a monument to her decline. Each bottle represented a surrender, an admission that her body couldn't function without chemical intervention. What if Dorothy was onto something? What if there was a way out of this pharmaceutical prison? The thought both excited and terrified her. Margaret had built her entire career on evidence-based medicine, on scientific studies and peer-reviewed research. Folk remedies and natural cures had always seemed like wishful thinking, the domain of people who didn't understand how the body really worked. But she also couldn't deny what she had seen with her own eyes. Dorothy's transformation was real, and Dorothy hadn't been some gullible person looking for a miracle. She had been just as skeptical, just as medicated, just as resigned to decline as Margaret herself. The next morning, Margaret woke after only 3 hours of fitful sleep. Her stomach burned, her joints ached, and she felt the familiar fog of exhaustion and medication settling over her mind. She made herself coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the garden Robert had planted, now overgrown because she didn't have the energy to maintain it. She thought about her day ahead. Nothing planned, no one expecting her, just the endless stretch of hours to fill before bedtime and another sleepless night. Then she thought about Dorothy's laugh, about the light in her eyes, about the way she had moved without pain. Margaret stood, grabbed her purse, and drove to the grocery store. It was early, just past 8, and the store was mostly empty, except for a few other early risers. She walked slowly through the produce section, finally finding the garlic in its mesh bags. She picked up one bulb, examining it like it might hold answers to questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. At the checkout, the young cashier girl, who couldn't be more than 20, with bright pink hair and multiple piercings, scanned the single item and gave Margaret a strange look. "Just the garlic?" she asked, her tone implying this was somehow wrong or incomplete. "Just the garlic," Margaret confirmed. The girl shrugged and took Margaret's money. Once upon a time, Margaret might have cared what a stranger thought of her purchases. She might have made up some excuse about making pasta sauce or explained herself in some way. But that was one freedom that came with age. She didn't care what anyone thought anymore. She had earned the right to buy a single bulb of garlic at 8 in the morning without explanation. That evening, Margaret stood at her kitchen counter with the garlic bulb in front of her. She had spent the day researching online, reading articles and studies, trying to separate science from fiction. What she found surprised her. Garlic did have documented health benefits, anti-inflammatory properties, cardiovascular support, immune system boosting. It wasn't just folklore. There was actual research supporting its effects. Still, her hand hesitated as she peeled the papery skin from 2 cloves. The smell was strong, pungent, filling her small kitchen. She thought about calling Dorothy, asking for more details about how to do this, but something stopped her. If this worked, if it actually worked, she wanted to know for herself, not because someone had coached her through it. She held her breath, placed both cloves in her mouth, and chewed quickly. The taste was overwhelming, sharp, burning, almost violent in its intensity. She grabbed her water glass and drank deeply, washing down the pieces, tears streaming from her eyes from the burn. She immediately brushed her teeth, gagging slightly at the lingering taste. Then she brushed again, and once more for good measure. She gargled with mouthwash until her mouth felt numb. Finally, she went to bed, her mouth still tingling, expecting nothing. This was foolishness, desperation masquerading as hope. In the morning, she would feel the same, as always, tired, achy, foggy, and she would put this experiment behind her. But when she woke up the next morning, something was different. Not dramatically different, not miraculously transformed, but something had shifted in a way she couldn't quite name. The constant fog in her head, the mental cloudiness that had become her normal state, seemed lighter. When she got out of bed, her usual morning stiffness was there, but somehow less oppressive. She made it down the stairs without holding the railing quite so tightly, without the fear that her knees might give out halfway down. Margaret stood in her kitchen, the morning sun streaming through the window, and allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years, cautious hope. She was a scientist at heart, a nurse trained to trust evidence over anecdotes, data over wishful thinking. So she decided to conduct an experiment. She would continue eating the garlic cloves every night and track how she felt. She would be methodical, objective, honest. She would note every change, positive or negative. And she wouldn't tell anyone, especially not Jennifer, who would lecture her about unproven home remedies and interfering with her medication regimen. Jennifer meant well, but she didn't understand what it was like to feel trapped in a failing body, to be so desperate for relief that you try anything. 1 week passed. Margaret filled her small notebook with observations, writing each morning about how she slept, how her joints felt, what her energy level was like. By day 5, she noticed she was sleeping better. Not perfectly, she still woke once or twice, but she was falling back asleep instead of lying awake for hours. The acid reflux that had plagued her for years, waking her nightly, was nearly gone. 2 weeks in, she realized she hadn't taken her afternoon nap once. She had been taking a daily nap for 3 years, her body simply unable to make it through the day without that 2-hour rest. But suddenly she didn't need it. She had energy that lasted into the evening. By week 3, Margaret felt 20 years younger. She wrote in her notebook with a trembling hand, afraid to believe what was happening but unable to deny it. Her joint pain had decreased significantly. She could open jars without help. She could walk upstairs without pausing halfway. She had energy she hadn't experienced in years. Real energy, not the jittery, false energy that came from too much coffee. One morning, she looked out her kitchen window at Robert's overgrown garden and felt something she hadn't felt in 5 years, the desire to work in it. She spent an hour pulling weeds, her back protesting but holding up. When she came inside, dirty and sweating, she felt more alive than she had in years. She started taking walks around the neighborhood, something she'd abandoned long ago when even a trip to the mailbox left her exhausted. At first, just to the corner and back, then around the block, then 2 blocks. Her neighbors waved, surprised to see her out. but she kept it to herself. Old habits from a lifetime of dealing with skeptical doctors made her cautious about sharing. She had learned that people dismissed what they didn't understand, that testimonials were dismissed as placebo effects or coincidence. So she continued her experiment in silence, methodically noting every change in the small notebook she kept by her bed. The notebook became her confidant, the only witness to her transformation. Each entry was a small rebellion against the resignation she had felt for so long, a whisper of hope growing louder with each passing day. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. At her next doctor's appointment, Dr. Phillips studied her test results 3 times before speaking, his confusion evident. "Margaret, your inflammation markers are down significantly. Your blood pressure is better than it's been in 5 years. What have you been doing differently?" Margaret hesitated. Dr. Phillips was young, barely 40, the type who believed modern medicine had all the answers. But his genuine curiosity made her answer honestly. "Raw garlic, 2 cloves every night before bed." She braced for the dismissive laugh, the lecture about scientific evidence, the warnings about medication interactions. Instead, Dr. Phillips leaned back, studying her with new interest. "Garlic has allicin, a compound with significant anti-inflammatory properties. There's substantial research supporting its cardiovascular benefits. How long have you been doing this?" 6 weeks. "And nothing else changed? Diet, exercise, medications?" "I've been walking more because I have the energy now. But no, nothing else." Dr. Phillips made notes. "If these improvements continue, we might be able to reduce some of your medications. Keep doing what you're doing, and let's recheck in 6 weeks." Margaret left the office feeling vindicated but also angry. Something so simple, so inexpensive, had never been suggested in all these years of expensive prescriptions and side effects. She'd suffered unnecessarily because natural remedies were dismissed as folk medicine. She started telling others, her book club, her church group. Some looked at her like she'd lost her mind. Others, desperate enough to try anything, listened intently. Dorothy had been right all along. When you found something that gave you your life back, you wanted everyone to know. Jennifer finally noticed during Sunday dinner. "Mom, you look different. Are you wearing makeup?" "No makeup, just garlic." Jennifer's face cycled through confusion and concern. "What do you mean, garlic?" Margaret explained everything. Jennifer's reaction was predictable. Lectures about pseudoscience, warnings about liver damage, insistence she was risking her health. "Jennifer, I was dying slowly in that house, popping pills that made me feel worse. Now I feel alive again. My doctor supports it. My test results prove it works. I'm not asking for your permission." The words came out harsher than intended, but they needed saying. She'd spent too many years letting others make decisions about her body, her health, her life. 3 months in, Margaret had reduced her medications from 7 to 3 under Dr. Phillips' supervision. Her blood work was the best it had been in over a decade. She'd lost 15 pounds without trying, simply because she had energy to move again. More importantly, she'd found purpose. Word spread through her senior community. People asked questions, wanted to try it themselves. Margaret began hosting informational sessions at the community center, sharing what she'd learned, encouraging people to talk to their doctors, to advocate for themselves. Not everyone experienced dramatic results. Some couldn't tolerate raw garlic. Others found it helped, but didn't eliminate medications entirely. But enough people felt better that Margaret knew this was real. Dr. Phillips asked to document her case for a medical journal, an example of integrative medicine done right, combining traditional treatments with evidence-based natural remedies under medical supervision. 6 months after her first garlic cloves, Margaret stood before 40 seniors at the community center. She looked at their faces, some skeptical, some hopeful, all tired of being dismissed, of being told their pain was just aging. "I'm not saying garlic is a miracle cure," Margaret told them. "I'm not saying abandon your medications. What I'm saying is that sometimes the simplest solutions are ones we overlook. Our grandparents knew things modern medicine forgot in its rush toward pharmaceuticals. We deserve to feel good in these later years, not just survive them." Dorothy sat in the front row, beaming. After the presentation, a woman in her late 60s approached with tears in her eyes. "I've been on 12 medications, 12, and I feel worse every day. Do you really think something as simple as garlic could help?" Margaret took her hand. "I think it's worth trying. Talk to your doctor. Start slowly. Track how you feel. Your body will tell you if it's working. That night, Margaret ate her 2 cloves, the routine now as natural as breathing. She thought about the years she'd wasted accepting decline as inevitable, trusting that expensive prescriptions were her only option. She thought about pharmaceutical companies profiting from her suffering, about doctors who never mentioned simple dietary changes, about a system treating symptoms instead of addressing root causes. But mostly she thought about the future, about tomorrow's walks, about the people she'd help today, about reclaiming her health and with it, her life. Margaret had discovered something powerful, not just that garlic could improve her health, but that she still had power to make choices about her own body. At 73, she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, truly living, and she would make sure as many people as possible knew they could do the same.